He presents the second of a new series of programs under the auspices of the Council for Democracy with Rex Stout, distinguished parent of the even in the interlocutor's chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Stout.
Thank you, Milton Cross. On this program, we are reviving the old American Cracker Barrel, center of the forum in every crossroads store, sign and symbol of free discussion. Authors and journalists swap ideas with us and tell us things that sometimes don't get into their books and articles. On this radio Cracker Barrel, we speak of liberty. One of the toughest things in the world and the hardest to kill is a good word. And one of the best words we have is liberty. The men of Vichy have erased it from the motto of France. The French people will someday put it back again. For it can still quicken the blood of a man and put fire in his eye. It is still one of our sweetest and toughest words. We speak of it, liberty, on this program because our country is now confronted by a danger which requires a quickening of our blood and a fire in our eyes. And it is a double danger. There is the physical threat of the tank and bomb and torpedo, and the psychological threat of propaganda, both native and imported. It is of the latter, propaganda, that we shall talk this evening. And by good fortune, we have with us a guest who can speak with authority, Mr. Edmund Taylor, author of The Strategy of Terror, newspaper man and special correspondent, who has been all over Europe during wars and revolutions. Any nation under conditions of war uses propaganda, the type employed depending naturally on the temperament, talent, and character of each nation concerned. Mr. Taylor has made a special study of the devices used by the Germans in the present war, so we are asking him tonight to discuss them. Mr. Taylor, will you tell us something of the propaganda you've seen in operation overseas?
Gladly, Mr. Stout. But first, if I may make a personal remark, I'd like to mention something that I meant to tell you before we went on the air. Your face is dirty.
Well, what? You're crazy. I washed my hands and face less than an hour ago.
Oh, your hands are all right, but your face is very dirty.
I don't believe it. I looked in the mirror in the washroom.
Maybe you did, but I'm looking straight at you now, and frankly, you're a sight. You must have been eating mud pies. Dirty is putting it mildly.
Well, for Mr. Cross, is there a mirror around here anywhere?
I don't know, but I'll try to find one.
Anybody got a mirror?
Don't bother, Mr. Cross. Propaganda, Stout.
What do you mean, propaganda?
I mean, that was it, and it worked. You notice I didn't say your hands were dirty or that you had lost a button from your coat. One glance would have shown you that I was lying, but you can't glance at your face. You knew very well your face wasn't dirty, but in 10 seconds I had you yelling for a mirror. In the same way, defeat us in this country, for instance, inject the poison of doubt into us. They aren't stupid enough to try to persuade Americans that they are cowards and quitters, or that their Navy is no good. More shrewdly, they did it into us day after day that the Nazis are too hot to handle and that the British are already licked. That is no more true than my statement that your face was dirty, but you began yelling for a mirror.
After this, I'll carry my own mirror. But are you saying that all propaganda is merely a pack of lies?
By no means. For instance, if your face really had been dirty, I would have said, Mr. Stout, you're black in the face. You must have the bubonic plague or something. You would have looked in the mirror and then called for a thermometer. That's just how the Nazis work. They announce victories in the Balkans, which are true. Then they say this proves that the democracies were doomed before they started to fight, that the trend is against them. In the same way, Hitler's armies stamp out democracy in Europe, and Nazi propaganda says, you see, Europe has discarded democracy and gone fascist. They can't stamp out our democracy by force, so they try to talk us out of it. One day they tell us democracy is inefficient, that we do nothing but argue and have no discipline. The next day they say the trouble with us is we're not a real democracy, just a Pluto democracy, a dictatorship of plutocrats, which oppresses the masses and has no respect for human rights.
Well, even the Nazis can't have their cake and eat it, too. But if people in America fall for that poppycock with the nearest German tank 3,000 miles away, it must be even more effective when the tank is around the corner and the plane is over your head. You've been as close as that to it, haven't you?
Yes, I think I can say that I have, Mr. Stout. I was in France before and during the collapse, and I can assure you that adroitly handled propaganda can be just as effective a military weapon as a piece of artillery.
I believe you. While it can't blow up a bridge, it can blow morale into fragments.
And it can operate even more directly than that. In that awful mess in northern France, one trouble with the French army was that it could not move from here to there. You can't drive tanks along a stretch of road that's clogged with 100,000 panic-stricken old men and women and children with carts and baby carriages and bicycles. And they wouldn't have been clogging the roads if the Germans hadn't put them there by creating the panic that drove them out of their villages. They did it by spreading the propaganda that they would all be murdered, or worse, when the Nazis came.
How did they do that?
Radio, fifth columnists, that wasn't hard. It didn't take more than 2 or 3 trained alarm spreaders to a village to start them going.
It wouldn't have been a bad idea to have a couple of trained alarm quieters on the job.
Sure, but that's one trouble with really ingenious propaganda. You can't combat it ahead of time. That particular trick will never work again, because now they're on to it. If the Germans ever get to Britain, they won't find the roads clogged by anything but barbed wire, tank traps, landmines, and guns.
If they get to Britain, what about their secret weapons? Last spring, an awful lot of Americans were persuaded that the Nazis had so many irresistible secret weapons that they hardly knew which one to use first. Did the French and Belgians swallow that, too?
Most of them did.
I remember particularly the fairy tale about that Belgian fort, Eben Email.
Yes, that was an amazing performance. Amazing because the Germans, who based their national pride on their military prowess more than any other people, gave the credit for the capture of that fortress to a secret weapon, when actually it was a military exploit of unsurpassable brilliance and audacity. It was an achievement that any army would have been proud of. But they took it away from the army and handed it to Goebbels, so that he could scare the daylights out of the French and the British. And apparently, from what you say, Americans too, with a lot of hooey about secret weapons.
That was tough on the army, and it was pretty slick. But any psychology primer would tell you that a terror of the unknown is harder on the nerves than of anything known, no matter how bad it is. I wonder why they didn't make more use of the secret weapon bogey in specific instances.
They did on some occasions, which perhaps never reached America. As an example, a fellow I met in Paris. Now, he was an intelligent man, but to show you what propaganda can do with the people already in a state of nerves, he came to me one day with the real lowdown. He had picked it up in Brussels. The Germans had invented a perfect devil of an explosive. It had everything, including perpetual motion. It began exploding and kept right on exploding, without ever stopping, bang after bang. But, and here this intelligent fellow's face brightened a little bit, they couldn't use it.
Why not?
Because they were afraid that they wouldn't be able to stop it. It would go right on around the world and come to Germany and destroy them, too. According to my white-faced friend, they were guarding it with fantastic precautions and keeping it for their ace in the hole. They wouldn't use it unless things got hopeless, but if that time ever came, they would touch it off.
That strikes me as really slick. Naturally, if you believed the Germans had that up their sleeve, you wouldn't want to do anything to make them hopeless. Sort of reverse English.
They often use stuff with reverse English. As, for instance, the line they took in Poland. The Polish army was getting licked by tremendously superior equipment, especially airplanes, but the morale of the people was still amazingly good. So suddenly, here comes, by radio and word of mouth, news of great Polish victories.
Came from where? The Germans?
Sure. The idea was to elate the Poles, fill them with hope and joy and pride, so that next day, when the real news came, the bitter disappointment would tear them to pieces. And finally, it did.
It did. But now how do they work it when they're dealing with neutrals? You've probably run into a good deal of it yourself.
Well, here's a sample. In Madrid last summer, a Nazi official very blandly invited an American correspondent I know to have lunch with him at Simpson's restaurant in London 3 months later.
And didn't German firms in Mexico and South America take orders last spring for fall delivery of goods from Germany and even post cash bonds to guarantee performance of the contract?
Yes, it must have cost them a lot of money, but they charged it off as contact or advertising. It's all part of the legend of invincibility that they've been trying to build up. Of course, this legend of invincibility isn't so convincing if you've lived in Europe a good bit. The joke of it is that the Germans, like the Italians and the Russians and all Europeans, still believe in their hearts that there is nothing in the world like Yankee efficiency, and their new orders and revolutions are simply clumsy attempts to adapt American methods to European conditions. America today, as for decades past, is the hope of one half of Europe and the dread of the other half. The real reason why the Nazis have a mortal hatred of America, why they know they can never be safe while America exists, is that they realize their slave economy cannot compete with our free economy, that their political system cannot exist in a world dominated by American industrial strength and the American spirit of freedom. The fascists are powerful, but they themselves fear the power of America.
In other words, some Americans have less faith in our own democracy than the enemy has.
Yes, and yet the overwhelming majority of Americans believe in their country and believe in democracy, know that America is the strongest force in the modern world, and that democracy is what makes us strong. No propaganda in the machine in the world can ever talk Americans out of believing in democracy. I feel absolutely sure of that. But propaganda can momentarily confuse and discourage us and get us quarreling among ourselves, while a foreign enemy is preparing an attack against us. The effects of such propaganda can't last very long, but they can last long enough to inhibit our defense effort and give the enemy a big initial advantage in his attack on us.
Take that question of quarreling among ourselves, setting group against group. That was certainly one of the Nazis' best methods of recruiting fellow travelers in Europe before the war.
I saw it myself in Yugoslavia in 1938, in the fall. The Nazis had quite a hold down there, did a tremendous business. One day, when I was talking to the foreign editor of a semi-official paper, the advertising manager walked in and laid a pile of papers on the editor's desk. The editor turned to me and explained that this was material covered by an advertising contract. A German firm had bought large amounts of advertising in the paper, and to get the contract, they had to agree to run, without comment, a specified amount of anti-Semitic material prepared in Germany.
You mean with Nazis, anti-Semitism is a weapon, a factor in military strategy. They try to use it here right now.
Yes, and if they can work up a certain amount of anti-Jewish feeling and tension here, they have persuaded some Americans to identify themselves, unconsciously, with one of the basic elements of the Nazi doctrine. You just can't be an anti-Semite and believe in democracy at the same time. And if anti-Semitism made any headway in this country, it would divide us and weaken us, playing into Hitler's hands.
They're working in the same way with other minority groups, trying to stir them up against each other and make us suspicious of them. Of course, the object all the way through is disunion and paralysis. Mr. Taylor, as an expert, what do you think we can do to combat all this propaganda business?
I'm afraid far too many of us think that there's some sort of patent remedy against propaganda. Well, that just isn't so. You can't stop propaganda these days. It's put out in too many devious and different ways. Shortwave radio in colored news stories from Berlin, facts exaggerated into terrifying rumor. We can't stop it, but we can stop being frightened by it. In the long run, the only effective defense against propaganda is to be so intent on fighting our own fight and winning it that we haven't time to worry about what the other fellow is saying. The only thing we need to fear is fear, and the only way to conquer fear is to do your duty. That's the reason why, in my opinion, neither propaganda nor bombs can break England's morale. And you can't tell me Americans are less brave than Englishmen. But perhaps we worry too much about the day-to-day progress of the war.
Right. And doubtless that is why there have been some faint hearts lately. I've actually heard the Yugoslavs, for instance, denounced for having had the incredible stupidity to fight.
Yes, there were plenty of flowers for the brave and noble Serbs before the battle started, but the minute they started dying for their ideals, they became just suckers to some people. You can't believe in democracy and believe at the same time that a man who is willing to die for it is a sucker.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest this evening has been Edmund Taylor, newspaperman, foreign correspondent, and special student of the effects of propaganda. All countries at war use propaganda, the type employed depending naturally on the temperament, talent, and character of each nation concerned. Mr. Taylor has discussed the propaganda methods used by the Germans in the present war. This is Rex Stout, saying goodbye until next week.
You have just heard the second of a new series of programs entitled Speaking of Liberty, brought to you each Thursday evening at this time by the National Broadcasting Company in cooperation with the Council for Democracy, a national organization dedicated to the propagation of an American faith in democracy. Next week, Rex Stout will bring Clifton Fadiman to the microphone. A copy of the script of this broadcast will be mailed free to anyone requesting it. Please address your letter or card to the Council for Democracy, 285 Madison Avenue, New York City. Speaking of Liberty has been presented as a public service by NBC and the independent radio stations associated with the Red Network of the National Broadcasting Company.